in just a moment here. Hopefully you can hear us okay. If you can hear my mic, let me know. Somebody just put something in the chat. Let me know you can hear me. Awesome. Matt, why don't you go ahead and do a quick mic check?
Mic check.
All right, we got a few people still joining on a little bit late here, so we're just going to give them about another minute, and then we will kick it off. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us tonight. Hope you guys find some great information out of this. Lynn, you can't hear us, but you responded that you can hear. Yeah, check what Lisa said. It's got to be the volume on your device. Just make sure your volume is turned up. All right, let's see where we're at here. All right, so I think we're going to kick this off so we stay on schedule. I know we still have a few late stragglers on there, but they'll join on to us. So, all right, so good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Noel Bonk. I am the founder of BonkWorks Endurance Sports. And again, thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. So tonight we're going to be talking about nutrition basics for cycling, and this is the first of 3 spring webinars that we'll be hosting. The next one will be in April, and that's going to be a case study on planning, racing, and analyzing power data for bike and run splits at Ironman Lake Placid. And the third one, a little bit later in the spring, is going to be the introduction to run power using the Stride Running Power Meter. So please swing by our Facebook or our website for more info on those events, or feel free to message or email myself or Matt. So a couple of quick announcements here before we kick this off and I introduce our presenter. So as you watch tonight's presentation, you're going to have 2 options for asking questions. Most of you have already kind of figured out that chat function on the right-hand side. But if you scroll down underneath the slides, you'll see an option to actually put questions in there. So you can really use both. Matt may tell you once he starts his presentation if he has a preference for one or the other. I'll be watching those as well, okay? Tonight's presentation will be recorded, and you'll receive an email shortly after the presentation to that link, so feel free to share that. And I'll also post that link out to social media for those who may have missed it, okay? Also, you may see a pop-up message about 30 minutes into the presentation. It'll pop up on top of the screen and also at the bottom of the screen. This is just a promotional offer for those that are attending the live session and have an interest in either the nutritional consultation or the coaching. So it'll just take you to a link to our website that you can fill out a form and reach out to us for that, okay? So, all right, so with that, I'd like to introduce Matt Stair. Matt is not only a BonkWorks coach and a USA cycling coach, but is also a practicing doctor of physical therapy. He's precision nutrition certified, and he's a certified strength and conditioning specialist. So Matt grew up racing and riding just a little bit south of Syracuse here, down at the Velodrome in Trexlertown, Pennsylvania, and on the roads throughout Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. He likes to refer to himself as an all-around performance, nutrition, and wellness geek, and he uses that passion and knowledge to help his clients reach their personal athletic goals. And so with that, I'm going to pass over the presentation over to Matt.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this evening's webinar. My goal here is to spread information, obviously, and hopefully everybody can learn at least a little something from this webinar. We're going to cover a lot of basic information tonight, so hopefully you already know a lot of what I'm going to talk about, but my hope is that you'll learn at least something, and more importantly than learning something, you learn something that you can actually apply, because obviously we know that if we have knowledge but we don't actually apply it, the knowledge is not that useful. So like Noel said, if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to ask down in the chat box or down below in the open questions. It might be a second or two before I realize that there's a question in there, just because the way the screens are set up. I can't see the questions as they pop up, but I will routinely scan down there and look in that area. So just so everyone's aware of that. So the things we're going to be covering tonight, like I said, the basics, right? So, you know, we're going to talk about things like real food, nutrient density, what macronutrients are. We're going to talk about putting knowledge into practice. And then we're going to talk a little bit about eating for performance, eating for weight loss, and eating to feel our best. So my basic premise here in kind of putting this together, like Noel said, I'm very much into the health, nutrition, fitness, wellness space. And unfortunately, a lot of cyclists and endurance athletes in general are eating what we would refer to as a standard American diet, which in nutrition circles, they refer to it as SAD or SAD, Standard American Diet. And the exception to that is that most of us as cyclists, we think, well, we need to eat more carbohydrates. And then, you know, while we're on the bike, we ingest even more carbohydrates in the forms of drinks and gels and bars and the like. So when I talk about standard American diet, you know, I'm thinking, you know, the way most Americans eat, which is fast food, processed food, junk food, frozen dinners. And you say, well, I don't eat all those things. But, you know, a lot of Americans are, and a lot of, again, cyclists and endurance athletes are. So hopefully we can shed some light on some better practices, and you can learn some things about how to improve your nutrition. Again, the standard American diet, it's not optimal for health, and it's not optimal for performance either. So we want to try to improve on that as much as we can. So also by way of introduction here, just to say, nutrition is a very complicated topic, right? So we could talk about, I could split this up into multiple webinars. You know, there are obviously many books written every year on nutrition. There's a lot of different viewpoints. There's a lot of different contradictory research. You know, if you follow the popular, and if you look on just newspapers and magazines and bookshelves and things like that, you'll find there's an incredible variety of different, you know, dietary guidelines, dietary advice out there. So again, this webinar is going to focus mostly on the basics, and I'm going to try not to get into, you know, any one overly dogmatic approach or anything along those lines. And then just also to say, you know, this is information. I'm not trying to diagnose, treat, or cure any illnesses through this presentation. So before we get really into the nutrition piece, let me just throw out there a little tidbit to start out with about this concept of knowledge versus motivation, right? So tonight's focus is going to be mostly on knowledge, but we're also going to talk a little bit about motivation, because in the nutrition space, both of these are very important, right? So if somebody has a lot of knowledge about nutrition, but they aren't motivated to actually apply that, it's not very useful. Likewise, if somebody's very motivated, but their knowledge is not good, you know, or if they're applying the wrong things, that also is going to be a suboptimal outcome. So, you know, some folks, they know what they should be eating and they aren't eating it. Other folks think that, you know, okay, well, you know, you know, I've been told that I need more carbohydrates. All carbohydrates are the same. You know, I'm very motivated. I'm just going to keep pounding the carbohydrates, things along those lines. So, so again, it's this combination of knowledge and motivation. So tonight, hopefully you'll get the knowledge piece down. Hopefully I can shed a little bit of light also on the motivation piece. And if you're struggling in that area, maybe give you some tips there as well. We'll also talk about how we can use motivation and habit creation to reach our nutrition goals. Like Noel said, I've my coaching in nutrition was done through a company called Precision Nutrition, and Precision Nutrition is all about habit change and transforming our habits, rather than focusing again on, you know, eliminating food groups or you know, or a certain approach, you know, always having the exact same meals or anything along those lines. It's more of an overarching theme, and it's about creating healthy habits that you can continue to apply day after day after day. You know, a lot of nutrition and diet books, they focus a lot on a particular diet that people stick to for a period of time, and then they kind of lose their way and they go back to their old ways of eating. So again, this habit creation is really key. So I'll also just throw out there again, you know, like I alluded to earlier, there's a lot of different viewpoints on this. Nutrition science is a young science. It is not set in stone. But today, hopefully, we'll set up a good framework that will be helpful in creating better nutrition choices for everyone. So let's move right along here. So if anyone wants to throw something in there in the chat box and just let me know what your goals are here, for, as far as nutrition goes, maybe even your goals of what you'd like to learn tonight, although I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to everything. But for most folks, most cyclists, their nutrition goals are going to fall into one of these 4 categories here of losing weight, which really most people, when they say lose weight, they really want to lose fat. Most people don't want to lose weight that isn't fat. Other folks, they may say, I want to improve my power to weight ratio, which again, those two go almost hand in hand, right? So, if we're losing weight, we would assume that should improve our power to weight ratio. Improving endurance. So I see Dave there says the endurance component is important for him. So that's something we'll talk about a little bit here. If indeed, nutrition is a limiting factor for improving endurance, and then performing and feeling better. So, and I see Thanos there says power to weight and feeling good, right? I think most of us would say we do want to feel good, right? And we want to know that I can improve my endurance, I can improve my power weight, but if it's going to make me feel lousy at the end of the day, that's not going to be a whole lot of fun either. So most of us want to have fun with our cycling as well. So improving power to weight ratio there again. So a few different concepts. So I think most people are, again, fitting into one of these few different categories that we have here. So hopefully we'll touch on each of those through this evening. And then if there's more questions that I'm not answering as we go along here, please feel free to chime in with those. So, all right, 100-mile mountain bike races. Good on you, Bill. I go for it there. I'm just looking at a few of these comments here. When do you eat what types of food throughout the day? Okay, yeah, we're going to touch on that one as well. So, all right, very good. So let's see here. So some nutrition myths I wanted to focus on here. Just, again, kind of, where are people coming from? What are some commonly held beliefs, things along those lines. As I said earlier, for a lot of the endurance community, for a lot of cyclists, there's this kind of idea that only macros matter, right? Historically, the sole focus was pretty much on just getting enough carbohydrates. I've been a cyclist for a very long time, and pretty much when I was younger, when I was cycling in my teens and 20s, it was as long as I ingested enough carbohydrates, that was all that really mattered, right? And unfortunately, oftentimes we ignore the quality of these carbohydrates, right? So if you think about quality instead of just quantity, think about the nutrition of a sweet potato versus something like a Pop-Tart, or a banana versus a can of soda. Again, all those foods are primarily carbohydrates, but I think we would all agree that a potato and a Pop-Tart aren't the same thing, and a banana and a can of soda aren't the same thing. These next two myths kind of go hand in hand, right? Anything burns if the furnace is hot enough, or I can eat whatever I want because I'll burn it off on the bike. And again, this has been the predominant paradigm for the last several decades, probably. We could eat I can eat whatever I want because I'm just going to go burn it off afterwards. I can, down pizza. I can, eat burgers and fries. I can drink milkshakes. I can do whatever I want. And eventually I'll burn off on the bike anyway, so it's all good. Another one of the last one there, this concept of fat is bad for you, and this one's almost taken a 100 degree or 180 degree turn in the last maybe 5 or 10 years, right? We used to think, for the last 40 years, the paradigm has been that low fat paradigm, right? Fat is bad for us. I can remember when I was a younger cyclist, fat was bad, and I would try to minimize fat as much as possible in my diet. I would my breakfast would typically be a fat-free cereal with fat-free milk and fat-free orange juice, and that would be almost every day how I would start my day. Well, we know that actually that fat is important, and now there's actually, again, almost like this swing of the pendulum, where there are athletes now who are eating even crazy high amounts of fat, right? And we say, well, how can that be healthy, right? They're doing these keto diets and things like that, and I'm not going to get into the whole keto diet this evening too much, but just to say that it's out there, and I will definitely say we don't want to say that fat is evil and we should be avoiding it at all costs. So, oh wow, look at that. So Jamie says, I just had a cardiologist tell me if I want to lower my cholesterol to eat fat and avoid carbs. So there you go. Somebody's got a different idea than the one that we've been told for the last again, like 40 years. So so you can see there is a big time shift in that paradigm of the low fat eating. So here's the basic truth that I want to get across that I think is very counter to this standard American diet. This concept of JERF, or just eat real food. So real foods provide real nutrition, nutrient density. I think Soja mentioned that nutrient density is important, right? Not engineered by men in laboratories and to make us want more of them. So there's this crazy truth. And this, you know, when I say these things, people like shake their heads in disbelief, but it's true. Food manufacturers are creating foods to make us want more of them and make it difficult to stop eating them, right? And if one of your goals is to improve your power to weight ratio, probably finding a food that you just want to continue to eat more of is not going to be beneficial for you. So literally these engineers sit in laboratories and they look at things like mouthfeel and how they can add salt or sugar or a chemical to a product to make us want to eat more of them, right? Like that's their job, because for a food manufacturer, the goal is to sell as much product as possible. So if I can make a product that when you sit down to eat it, you're always going to finish the entire bag of it, well, I'm going to be able to sell more bags of that product. Conversely, if we're eating real food is hard for us to overeat. Most of us are not going to sit down and you know, keep eating carrots until we've torn through an entire 1-pound bag of carrots or something along those lines, because our bodies are going to tell us, okay, that's enough of this. Let's move on to something else. So you know, here's another concept I want to get across. Good nutrition is the same for most humans, right? So we're all humans first and we're all cyclists second. So we might need to have more calories than the average American because we're burning more calories on the bike. We might need more carbohydrates, again, under the same premise, but good nutrition is good nutrition. So most of us need to be eating real food if we're going to function well as humans and therefore function well as cyclists. So another thing I'll throw out there, we often hear these stories of gifted athletes who eat piles of pancakes for breakfast. They smear Nutella on everything. You know, they have a large pizza delivered midway through a run, something along those lines. And we think, well, you know, these guys are eating pancakes and pizza and Nutella. I can eat all those things too. I will tell you that, you know, a lot of those athletes, you know, we're hearing those stories because they are outliers, right? They are already the elite of the elite. And for them, they may be able to get away with things like that. For most of us, I think that's not going to lead to us reaching our optimal potential. And the other thing I'll say is that I think we can get away with a lot more perhaps bad nutrition in our younger years. And then as we age into our 30s and 40s and beyond, it becomes more and more difficult to reach our true potential if our diet is not dialed in, right? So maybe you could get away with stopping at McDonald's on the way to a race when you were in your 20s and you performed just great in that race, but now you find that you go, you know, if you eat McDonald's on the way to the race, your race performance isn't everything that it could be. And if you've been eating McDonald's for the last 20 years, you're probably not performing up to your potential. So also there, I say bikes, gels, drink mixes, bars, things along those lines. Those are great on the bike, right? I'm not encouraging, you know, as much as I say eat real food, I'm not encouraging you to stick sweet potatoes in your back pocket when you go out for a ride, or, you know, that you need to take some, you know, take a chunk of butternut squash with you on a ride, right? The bars and the gels and things along those lines, those are really good for taking on the bike. It's easy enough to slip a banana in the back pocket, maybe. It's easy to slip a bar in the back pocket. But again, you know, we need to focus primarily on our off the bike nutrition, because that's where we spend most of our time. We don't spend, for most of us, you know, we spend maybe a couple hours a day, if that, on the bike. So by dialing in our nutrition off the bike, we'll have better performances on the bike, and we can save those things like the bars, the gels, and the drink mixes for when we are on the bike. So moving along here. So this concept of nutrient density, I've mentioned it a couple times now, and the concept of nutrient density is a concept a lot of folks haven't heard of. So nutrient density is the relationship between the nutrients in the food and the calories in the food, right? So there are some foods that are not nutrient dense. There are cookies, candy bars, and soda, right? Lots of calories, but if we look at how much nutrition is in them, we find that there's not a lot of nutrition. Those would be low nutrient density foods. Nutrient dense foods, on the other hand, have a lot of micronutrients in them. And so this is separate from their macronutrient content, right? We're not saying that this is food, a high fat food or a low fat food, which is what most of us are used to hearing about. But we're saying how much nutrition is in that food, because nutrition is what our body needs in order to perform all those cellular functions that make us healthy human beings and therefore better athletes. So some examples of nutrient dense foods: liver, right? Liver is a nutrient dense powerhouse. I'm sure everybody's eating lots of liver. Salmon, sardines, kale, egg yolks, herbs, fresh vegetables, blueberries, other types of berries, things along those lines. Those are foods that are packed with nutrition, and they aren't necessarily very calorically dense, okay? So I'm not saying that we need to only eat these foods. Certainly a diet composed of just those foods would not be very exciting for most people. But what I will say is that we should make special efforts to include more nutrient-dense foods in our diet, and we should look at what the nutrient density of a food is. So I'm going to throw out an app here that you can use on your smartphone. I know it's available for iOS, and I'm assuming it's also available for Android. It's the Cronometer app. If you haven't used Cronometer, I would encourage you to download that and even just use it for a few days. It's Cronometer. It is an excellent app. It does track your macronutrients as well. I believe you can kind of customize it. It's free. There is a paid version of it, but if you're willing to put up with some ads, you can have the free version. And the free version, you can see there your macronutrient breakdown. You can see if you're reaching your targets, and it gives a fantastic breakdown of the micronutrients in the food that you're eating. So it will tell you, are you not getting enough B6? Are you not getting enough B12? Are you not getting enough vitamin C? Is your diet lacking in calcium? Things along those lines. I'm not saying you need to do this every day, but I would encourage you, use it for a few days and see if there is a glaring weakness in the micronutrients in your diet. So yeah, definitely something to look for, because like I said, a lot of folks, we've been so focused on macronutrients for the last several decades. All this talk of fat and protein and carbs and everything, and we've completely ignored nutrient density for much of the time. So, and Noel put up a good website link there too. Yeah, and just look in the App Store and you'll find it there as well. So the next question here: where does the energy come from to power our bikes? Right, when we're out there on a bike ride, where does that energy come from? Well, in one way or another, it all came from what we ate and what we drank, right? And this comes down to these three macronutrients, which are carbs, fat, and protein. There is actually another source of calories in a lot of Americans' diets that does not fit into these, and I'm hoping you're all minimizing in your diet, and that is alcohol, because that's not necessarily something to help you power the bike very well. But carbs, fat, and protein are what we refer to as the three macronutrients. So we all know that what a carbohydrate is, hopefully, but again, this is where we've talked for the last, several decades of where most of our energy comes from is carbohydrates. Oh, before I even go into this carbohydrate piece, let me say one other thing there. So I said on the last slide, where does this come from? It comes from carbohydrates, fat, and protein, not only in what we eat, right? But then we also store body fat, right? And when we store body fat, the body fat can actually become the energy that we burn on the bike as well. So just to say, it's not just what we're eating, but it's also the stores that we already have on board, right? So, and likewise, we store glycogen. We store glycogen in our liver and primarily in our muscles. So that's already there for us. So even if we went out for a ride and we hadn't eaten anything that morning, or even if we hadn't eaten anything for 24, 48, even 72 hours prior, it doesn't mean we don't have any energy. The energy has just already been stored. But again, originally that energy came from carbs, fat, and protein. So nearly all foods are a combination of macronutrients. There are very few foods out there that are, solely fat. Oil would be the example there. There are some things that are primarily carbohydrates, but even most, fruits and vegetables, there are small quantities of protein and fat in a lot of those things, primarily protein, but even like an avocado, we all think, avocado is all fat, but there are trace amounts of carbs and things like that in there. So what are the primary sources of carbohydrates? Cookies, right? Oh, wait. Bread, pasta, vegetables, fruit, dried fruit, grains, oatmeal, sugar, soda, muffins, muesli, skim milk, pretzels, candies, cookies, fruit drinks, and drink mixes. So this is obviously a very, it's a limited list on one hand, but on the other hand, it's a list of good, bad, and indifferent, right? I'm not saying that these are all the foods you should eat. I'm not saying, hey, everybody go out and drink soda, eat sugar, and pile down the candy, because this is a good source of carbohydrates. But again, let's go back to our previous concept of nutrient density, right? So some of these are obviously going to be more nutrient dense than others. So if I need to get in, if I determine that I need, 500 grams of carbohydrates, 500 grams of carbohydrates from bread and pasta is going to be a lot different from 500 grams of carbohydrates from vegetables and fruit, for instance. When possible, I would recommend choosing more carbohydrate sources that are whole foods, such as sweet potatoes, white potatoes, squash, bananas, oranges, other types of fruit, bananas, apples, things along those lines. Some of the less favorable choices, white bread, white rice, sugary beverages, things along those lines. So most of these things, I would say, exist along kind of a continuum. And the continuum, on one hand, we have, these are the eat rarely foods or foods more to avoid. On the other hand, we have like, these are the best foods possible. And then there's a kind of a curve in between of a lot of different options. So, again, like the sugar and the soda is probably on the side there where we really want to eat those sparingly. I'm not going to say you should never drink soda again, but if you did, you'd be fine. If you didn't drink soda again, you would be fine, right? On the other end of the spectrum there, maybe we have things like, again, the sweet potatoes and the squash and the bananas and the fruit and things along those lines. We would want to err more towards the side or steer our diet more towards the side of eating those more nutrient-dense foods and fewer of the other foods on the other end of the spectrum. So just scan down there. I don't see any open questions there. So I see people are using the chat box, which is good. No, gluten-free, dairy-free, no added sugar, oatmeal raisin cookies on the. Yeah, there you go. Right. So the Thin Mints, yeah, and of course, there's also the taste and the enjoyment factor, right? So very few of us. This isn't something I was actually going to talk about, but very few of us eat food only because we need to eat food, or we're only trying to maximize our nutrition. Most of us eat food not just because not because our bodies need it, but because we enjoy eating it, right? It's also a social thing, right? We like to go out and eat with other people and things along those lines. So I'm not going to say, well, I'm going to say it, but I'm going to say don't adhere to this, the concept of moderation and everything. I don't like that concept necessarily. But I will say, again, think of it as not an all or nothing equation, right? I'm not saying everybody needs to eat only the whole and the perfect and never eat another Thin Mint in their life. But again, if your diet is comprised primarily of Thin Mints, probably not going to be the optimal diet for you and probably not going to give you the optimal outcome. Some more information here about carbohydrates. Minimum daily requirement. You see there's a couple questions there. 50 grams, 130 grams. The reality of the matter is we can survive without carbohydrates, right? And this has been demonstrated recently by the recent craze called the keto diet, right? Essentially, it's a no carbohydrate diet. There's some versions of the ketogenic diet that say we only need 20 grams of carbohydrate a day. You'll see there it says essential carbohydrates, none, right? So there are essential fats, there are essential amino acids, but there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. That said, I'm not advocating a zero carbohydrate diet. What is the function of carbohydrates? Primarily, it's to provide our bodies with energy. If we're looking for carbohydrates, what should we look for? Higher fiber, less processed foods, foods rich in antioxidants, and again, foods that are more nutrient dense. When do we want to time the eating of these carbohydrates? Obviously, we can eat them throughout the day, but before, during, and after exercise, those are the best times to be consuming our carbohydrates, because those carbohydrates then can be used to fuel our performance on the bike, on the run, in the pool, etc. So during exercise, one of the common recommendations, usually about 30 to 60 grams per hour is what we're looking for. And again, these recommendations vary widely, right? If you go above 60 grams per hour, you might have trouble digesting that and so forth. So we don't recommend going over 60 grams per hour. Again, it depends on whether you're truly fat adapted and things like that. Maybe you need to, or maybe you should be consuming fewer grams of carbohydrates than that. Some people are going to get an upset stomach as they increase their carbohydrate intake, things along those lines. So again, this is going to vary widely. So let me look over here in the chat box. I see a whole bunch of comments coming in. Let me make sure I'm addressing everything here. So Brendan asks, downside to sugar alcohols and some high fiber bars that lower glycemic index. Is there a downside? If that's your question, Brendan, yeah, there could be a downside to that, and it's called gut rot, right? So sugar alcohols sometimes ferment in our guts, and I haven't gotten to that yet, but that is one of the things we're going to talk about briefly at least. Is that sometimes these sugar alcohols do cause a problem, and that they call it that, like I said, they ferment in our intestines and such. And for some people, that is not going to feel very good, and they're going to have some serious gastrointestinal distress if they're not careful with that. So spirulina and chlorella, turmeric, and smoothies is a way to manage inflammation, asks Kevin. So yes, spirulina and chlorella, I think those are both great. Those are types of algae. They're well known for their detoxifying effects and so forth. Turmeric is something good for, like he says, they're managing inflammation. Curcumin supplements are very prevalent right now. So yeah, you could use things like that. I would say that the turmeric is more known for the anti-inflammatory effects there. But yeah, you could certainly do that. Some people won't like the flavor of turmeric in their smoothies, depending on what else is in there. But yeah, those are good options. Josh says, does the amount of grams per hour of exercise vary based on? Oh yeah, so let's see here. I was going to mention that, but I guess I don't have it there on the slide. Maybe we're going to get to it later. So what's happening is, as we're working at lower intensities, we're using more fat, and as we're working at higher intensities, we're going to burn more carbohydrates. And this is across the board going to be the case. Now, how much fat and how much carbohydrates we're burning is going to vary from individual to individual. So usually, at some point, so there's always a blend being burned, right? There's always a certain amount of carbohydrates, and again, as we're down at a low intensity, if we're going for a walk, if we're doing an easy recovery ride, we're burning primarily fat, but there's still probably some carbohydrates being burned, right? As we slowly increase the intensity, eventually, if you can imagine this, two lines on a graph, eventually those lines are going to cross, and the carbohydrates are going to become the predominant fuel source, and the fat is going to become a less predominant fuel source, such that when we're working at, an all-out intensity, we're really not burning a whole lot of fat there. We're burning primarily carbohydrates. So aerobic versus anaerobic work under the belief that you may burn one or more substrate or more of the other. So yeah, so if we're trying to burn, this concept of the fat burning zone, it's true. If we work at a lower intensity, we are going to burn a higher proportion of the calories being burned are from fat. Now, of course, because we're working at a lower intensity, we're actually going to be burning fewer calories also, so that complicates the equation a little bit. The other thing I'll throw out there is that if we become more fat adapted, as we say, and this is probably a whole separate webinar if people are interested in that, but as we become more fat adapted, we can actually teach our bodies to burn more fat, right? So to burn more of our storage fat, and they will rely less on glycogen and rely less on a continual replenishment of our carbohydrate stores. So there was a study done several years ago now called the FASTER study. And what they did was they fat adapted a group of athletes for, I believe, a period of a year leading up to the study. They took them into the laboratory. They had them run on the treadmill. They looked for that crossover point. When are they burning more fat? When are they burning more carbohydrates and things like that? And they found that these athletes were able to massively improve the intensity at which they could continue to burn fat. So normally we would say, okay, this guy, when he hits, 70% of his maximum, he's going to be burning almost all carbohydrates. Well, these guys, they had guys in the lab there running 7-minute miles and still burning primarily fat, which for most of us, if we're running a 7-minute mile, we're churning through carbs pretty good. So just to give you an idea there of how those carbohydrates, fat work together in the exercise equation. Craig asks, does the present body size determine the amount of intake? As far as carbohydrates, I would say no, because the issue here is going to be, at least in part, the gastric emptying and our body's ability to utilize the carbohydrates. So even if you're a larger individual, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can just continue to eat more carbohydrates. Like I wouldn't say, petite people eat 30 grams an hour, and larger individuals can consume 100 grams an hour or something along those lines. I would say it's going to vary, again, individual to individual. I think it varies more on the intensity and gastric emptying and things along those lines than it does on the size of the individual.
Kevin and Josh, you guys have some good questions there. So I think some of those are pretty lengthy questions that you guys are asking on there. So for us to stay on schedule, I'm going to ask that that you guys you connect with Matt after the presentation, if that's okay, so we can continue on.
All right, so we'll move on. And again, if you have questions, like Noel said, we can talk offline about these things if you're really interested. If the questions are short, I'll try to squeeze them in. But yeah, like Noel said, we don't want to run all night here. So our last macronutrient here, fat. What are some common sources of fat? Obviously, any of the oils, right? Canola oil, olive oil, grapeseed oil, corn oil, and fish oil, nuts, eggs, animal fats like lard and tallow and duck fat, butter, which in its refined form is called ghee, coconut and palm oil. Other sources include candy bars, chicken skin, French fries, ice cream, full-fat dairy, potato chips, Doritos, Cinnabons, and cheesecake. So lots of different sources of fat out there. Again, some better than others, right? So our goal should be to look for whole foods, minimally processed options over more processed options. Try to get our fat through things like eggs, full-fat dairy, if you tolerate dairy well, grass-fed meats, fatty fish, rather than getting our fat from junk food and desserts. Why do we even need fat in the first place, right? So as I alluded to earlier, when I was younger, the idea was that we wanted to eat as much as we could eat, as much carbohydrates as we want, and eat as little fat as possible. That was kind of my thinking, right? The less fat, the better. Why do we need this? It is an energy source, right? So we can burn fat as fuel. It does help to manufacture and balance hormones. It forms our cell membranes and the brain and the nervous system. We look at the brain, it's primarily composed of fat. It helps to transport fat-soluble vitamins. So the fat-soluble vitamins are vitamins A, D, E, and K. And if you pay attention to the news, you know that those are in the news, right? Those are very important vitamins. And then those two essential fatty acids, essential meaning our bodies cannot produce them. Those would be omega-3 and omega-6. So the question comes in here about the oils are not nutrient dense at all. That is 100% true. Oils are not nutrient dense. Again, so if you're aiming for optimal nutrient density, getting fat, nutrient dense, eggs, full fat dairy, grass-fed meats, fatty fish, things along those lines. Coconut oil is just fat. There's nothing other than fat there. It's not loaded with micronutrients or anything along those lines. Annika's asking about plant-based. Are you looking for plant-based sources of fat? Nuts and seeds, those are excellent sources of fats for somebody who's trying to avoid things. Again, if you're vegan and you're completely avoiding the animal products, most of those that I mentioned are animal products, obviously, or all of them that I mentioned are animal products or come from animals in one way or another. So yeah, Seeds, nuts, almonds, walnuts, sunflower seeds, all those things are good sources of fat. Little warning there, they could be a little bit skewed in the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, but they are still excellent sources as opposed to, again, something like cottonseed oil or something along those lines that we often find in our foods today. So how much fat do we need? So the basic premise I want to get across here is that we do not need to completely avoid fat. I don't want to give out a number and say this is how much fat you need or this is how much fat you need to avoid or something along those lines. But I will say, a lot of the studies that have been done that say that fat is really this terrible thing, they're done in conjunction with a high carbohydrate diet, right? So they're feeding this chow to rats, and then the chow is basically, some nasty trans fat combined with a lot of carbohydrates, and there's no protein going on there. It's not real food, and that's where a lot of the danger lies. The high fat, high sugar foods, those are really what we need to stay away from, just from the standpoint of that they're simply easy to overeat, right? So if we look at some high fat, high sugar foods, I'm going to ruin everyone's night because I'm going to say the things that everybody likes. Cheesecake, ice cream, candy bars, milk chocolate, milkshakes, and pastries, right? All those things. There's lots of sugar, there's lots of fat. We like to eat them. They have a high reward value for our brain. They make our brain light up like a Christmas tree, and we want to just keep eating more of them. So again, just be aware of that. I'm not saying never eat cheesecake again, but I am saying just be aware that those are things that can kind of sidetrack our satiety and our reward system, and we may end up wanting to eat way more of them than we really should. Last macro, oh, did I say fat was the last macronutrient? Boy, I got ahead of myself here. So protein is our last macronutrient. Where do we get protein from? Animal sources: meat, chicken, salmon, tuna, cod, mackerel, tilapia, beef, deer, pig, turkey, guinea fowl, goat, lamb, duck, goose, and moose, right? Almost any animal is going to be a good source of protein. If we're trying to avoid animal products, we can eat things like beans and tofu. If we're if we're vegetarian but not vegan, we can eat things like eggs and dairy and the whey and the casein proteins and things along those lines. There's also protein bars and powders. So there's things like pea protein and whey protein and casein protein that come in powder form as well. Same concept, as much as possible, choose higher quality sources as much as possible. I would prefer to see people eating, getting their protein from things like steak and chicken or eggs and beans rather than getting most of their protein from a bar or a powder. The bars and powders are good and convenient when we need to, when we're on the run and things along those lines. But if possible, we want to try to eat our whole foods as much as possible. I'll also say that as far as the powders and protein bars go, I know at least for me personally, I can down, a protein shake that has 20 grams of protein in it. I slug the thing down. It really doesn't do much for me. I don't feel like it's filling, or I don't feel like I've had a lot or anything along those lines. Whereas if I eat, 20 grams of protein in the form of chicken or eggs or something along those lines, I think the whole food sources are more filling and, again, more nutrient dense. A couple of interesting questions here about eggs. Yeah, I've seen the headlines, right? So there was just another study released that so we were told for years eggs are bad. Then we were told the latest guidelines from the FDA say that cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of concern, that we should not be concerned with eating eggs. And then there was just another study released, unfortunately, that says, now eggs are a problem, and you shouldn't eat too many eggs and things along those lines. So, what is my take on eggs? My take on eggs is eat them. I think the individual results will vary. I think very few of these studies, if any, are what we would call a randomized controlled trial, where we're actually having people eat eggs and then seeing what happens to them. This is one of the challenges. This is kind of a side note, but this is one of the challenges in nutrition research, is it's hard to do a long-term randomized study. In other words, tell people to eat a certain way, eliminate all the other variables, and then see what the outcome is 20 or 30 years later, which is what we're talking about when we talk about eggs. Because in general, with something like eggs, the risk is supposedly heart disease, and that won't develop until our later years. So, if we wanted to really see, okay, are eggs good or bad, then we would need to take 100 people in their 20s or in their teens, and we say, this group's going to eat eggs, this group's not going to eat eggs. And in 50 years from now, if they all abide by that diet for the next 50 years, we'll be able to get a pretty good idea of where they're at, which you can tell that research is probably never going to happen. A lot of this research is population research, it's epidemiological research, which means they're looking across the population, they're saying, okay, these people ate more eggs over the last 20 years, these people ate less eggs over the last 20 years. Who has better health outcomes? So one of the confounding things in this study that just came out about eggs was they were looking at not just egg consumption, but they were looking at egg consumption, but they were looking at across the board. Like, so if you ate eggs in the source, as in like they were included in a brownie, that was considered to be you were eating eggs, right? If you were eating eggs because you were going to IHOP every day and IHOP uses eggs in their pancakes, well, that makes it very easy to say, okay, well, you've eaten a lot of eggs. Well, they're not eating, pastured eggs over easy or something along those lines. So I would say, again, I think eggs are very nutritious. I would not advise limiting your egg consumption unless you're one of the people that has a very negative, obviously if you're allergic to eggs, avoid them. Or, do a before and after test if you can, see if you're really concerned about your cholesterol levels. And again, this is a very complicated topic, but you could test your cholesterol, eat lots of eggs, and then test your cholesterol again several months later after you've been eating eggs a lot and see if there's a difference there. Been led to believe chicken, turkey, and fish are best, and red meat is occasional. Oh, this is another long topic. Plant-based proteins are easier on the body to break down. Interesting regarding eggs. I'll just really briefly touch on the whole red meat thing. So again, the issue with red meat is primarily that we're looking at population-based studies, right? So when they say red meat is bad because the people that eat red meat are having worse health outcomes, over a lifetime. And again, this is pretty far from cycling, but red meat is very dense in nutrients. So, and what we see so from that standpoint, it should be good. There's ties to a whole bunch of, things like colon cancer, things along those lines, potentially. But unfortunately, what we have is the people that tend to eat the most red meat, particularly over the last 40 years or so, because we've been told over the last 40 years not to eat red meat, who do you think is eating most of the red meat over the last 40 years? It's the people who don't want to listen to those health recommendations, right? So when they look at the people who eat the most red meat, they're probably, the people that also smoke. They're probably also the people that are eating more fast food. They're also eating more fried food. They're getting their red meat from, they go to McDonald's and they get a burger and they get fries and they get a milkshake. They're more likely to drink excessively, things along those lines. They believe that they can ferret those things out with statistical analysis, and they can say, well, we can separate it and say it was really the red meat that's the problem. I think the statistical analysis is not that good. It's impossible to separate that. And if you're really interested in that, you can Google the phrase healthy user bias, and you'll see that, if we look at the healthy user bias, or the unhealthy user bias, that we can see that, a lot of times the results of these studies are skewed by more than one factor. It's impossible to say it was just the red meat because you don't have two exact populations where everything else is the same and red meat is the only difference in the population. So why do we need protein? Synthesis of muscle, hormones, enzymes, and immune cells. And then this concept of the amino acid pool. So like we said, we need to replenish our fat, we need to replenish our carbohydrates, but at the same time, our body the amino acids, I'm getting distracted by the chat box here. The amino acid pool needs to be continually replenished, right? So we need a regular supply of it. Our body stores fat, our body stores carbohydrates to some extent, but this amino acid pool needs replenishment constantly. So again, we need to make sure that we're regularly including protein in our diets. Let's see here. Next slide. There we go. How much protein do we need? It depends on the individual size, goals, and activity level. So this is the one. There was a question earlier about grams of carbohydrates on the bike for activity, things like that. Usually the protein requirements are based on body weight. A larger body is going to require more protein, right? The minimum recommendation commonly seen, again, lots of different opinions in this, 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. A common recommendation for weight loss is 1 gram per pound of body weight, which is a significantly higher number, you will notice, if you do the math there. The reason that we commonly recommend more protein for individuals trying to lose weight is because protein is much more difficult to overeat, right? So it's very what we call satiating, right? So when I talk to people about this, it's very easy for people to order extra large French fries and continue eating and eating and eating French fries. However, if I say, somebody sits down to a large steak, most people are not going to get done with a large steak and say, man, I really want to eat a second large steak. However, many people, again, would say, if I give you a slice of cheesecake, I could eat a slice of cheesecake and then I can eat another slice of cheesecake, right? Whether or not I actually do that is a different question. But again, protein, very satiating. So commonly when people are looking to lose weight, we recommend that they increase their protein intake to that 1 gram per pound of body weight. So putting knowledge into practice, let me just scan over here and see if there's any other nutritionfacts.org. Yeah, excellent recommendation there. Although, I would still question a lot of the research out there on eggs because, again, it's all epidemiological. Simple follow-up question. Okay, to go without red meat, especially for female athletes, for iron levels. Yeah, so there is a question there of some females during menstruation they lose iron, and therefore is it okay for women to go without red meat? Yes, I think it is okay. But I would maybe consider getting your iron levels checked, getting your ferritin checked there. Obviously, you can also supplement with iron. I can tell you that when I've taken supplements that have iron in them, I feel like somebody punched me in the gut afterwards. So I would, I would not. I would say that you do not need to eat red meat. I would say it's a great source of nutrition, though, if you tolerate it and if you enjoy eating red meat, it's a good option. Yes, blood tests are best if you can find good. So Josh asked the total body weight. I'm assuming that was back about the question mark. So it's, or the protein. Yeah, so it's per kilogram. And this is another thing, as Josh is kind of getting at there. There are a lot of different recommendations out there. So there are also recommendations as far as grams of protein per kilogram of lean body weight and things along those lines. So this one is 0.8 grams per kilogram of just body weight. So, all right, let's see here. All right, so putting knowledge into practice. The key to successful weight loss, behavior modification and creating new healthy habits, right? So here this is kind of going back to our original question of, okay, so we have knowledge, how do we actually apply this to everyday life and things along those lines? So the key to successful weight loss, behavior modification, creating new healthy habits, right? The key to improve performance, eating plenty of nutrient-dense foods, replenishing lost energy, and properly hydrating. The key to feeling your best, eliminating problem foods, and finding the food sources that work for you. So getting a little bit further into each of these things, let's first of all talk about this concept of achieving goals. So again, those are most of our goals, right? Our goals are to improve our power to weight ratio, to look and feel our best, to improve our endurance, things along those lines. So if you're looking to achieve goals, first of all, you have to know what your goal is, right? And then part of success is believing. So think about, the stories you tell yourself, right? So think about negative self-talk and self-fulfilling prophecies and things along those lines. This might sound a little woo-woo. We're getting out of the strict nutrition science here. But again, I think for a lot of people, they know what the best things are to do, but then they don't always actually apply them. So, ask yourself, what your goals are and what you hope to achieve. And, do your behaviors line up with your actions? This concept of environment versus discipline, I think this one's really important, right? So a lot of folks, they try to discipline themselves. I'm not going to, I'm going to avoid, these certain foods, and I'm just not going to do that anymore, and I'm going to stay away from that, and things along those lines. And I would, it's a lot easier to shape your environment than it is to constantly be applying discipline, right? So if you're always have a bowl of candy on the counter at home, if there's always donuts in the break room at work, if there's, when you go into your pantry and you look for a good healthy choice, and if you're everything that's looking you in the face is a processed, hyper palatable food that we want to eat too much of, you're going to be constantly applying a lot of discipline. I would recommend instead shaping the environment, right? So make it so that my best nutrition choices are the ones that are right there in front of me, and I don't have to go seek them out, right? The person who comes home and there's no food available and they're not sure what they're going to do, they're more likely to order the pizza versus the person who comes home and they already have, the crock pot of food that they started in the morning, and they're going to go ahead and eat that. Another concept we focus on a lot in precision nutrition: choose one habit to focus on for a few weeks, a couple weeks at a time, and then progress to the next habit. So you don't need to, don't think about, a complete revamp of all your nutrition. Think about, okay, what is one habit that I can focus on? One thing that I can do to improve my nutrition. Work on that for a couple weeks, and then consider how you've done with that, and think about how you can change that. So some habits to consider here, and again, these are, everybody's gonna maybe find something different, but my hope is that, again, just a few examples of things that you might want to consider. Add a protein source at breakfast. So some people, they're used to having, an English muffin and orange juice at breakfast, and then at 10 o'clock they're really hungry. So maybe if they included like an egg on their English muffin at breakfast, maybe they would be able to last until lunch, something along those lines. Add an extra serving of vegetables each day. So most people probably aren't eating enough vegetables, right? I routinely ask people, I ask them to tell me what they've been eating, and then they tell me, and I'm like, so where are the vegetables there, right? So if you're eating 5 servings of vegetables a day, try adding a 6th. If you're eating 6, try adding a 7th. If you're not eating any, try adding 1. Other concepts, shifting your carbohydrates to around the time of exercise. So again, our body is going to preferentially burn those carbohydrates around the times that we exercise. So again, this concept of nutrient timing, shift those carbohydrates to that window around the exercise, before, during, and after. Choose one hyperpalatable food to decrease or eliminate, right? So we talked about some of those foods that we tend to overeat. If our goal is weight loss, maybe we need to consider, okay, I'm not ready to give up everything yet, but, I'm not willing to put all those things aside, but I know Oreos are a real problem area for me. So I'm going to, I'm going to try to cut myself down from 4 Oreos a day to 3 Oreos a day for the next 2 weeks, and then I'm going to reassess and see where that goes. So again, small steps, one habit at a time. Experiment with a different carb source that doesn't cause GI upset, right? So if you're constantly feeling gut symptoms when you're exercising because, because of the sources of carbohydrates that you're ingesting, try a different source, right? Elimination of sugary beverages. That's an easy win for a lot of people if they can get themselves off the sodas and so forth that are providing them with lots of empty calories. Some more specific tips as far as weight loss goes, because again, if we can lose some fat, we can, fat loss, weight loss, we can improve our power to weight ratio. So the first one there, earn your carbohydrates, right? So if you're going to eat more carbohydrates, that means you should be exercising more. I'm not saying only exercise in order to allow yourself to eat more carbohydrates, but think about that. So think about, okay, I didn't exercise much today. I'm going to dial back my carbohydrates a little bit. Increasing nutrient density. You're less likely to have cravings, and you're less likely to overeat because your body's not going to be crying out for those nutrients. So if you increase your nutrient density, you will have less cravings, and you'll most likely end up with weight loss. Minimizing processed foods. So again, those foods that are created in laboratories, it's too easy to overeat those foods. Think about eating real whole foods. Removing liquid calories, eating until you're 80% full. This for a lot of people is going to be a strange concept, but just think about that. Think about when you're eating your dinner, as you're eating your dinner, think about the food you're eating and think, okay, how full am I? I don't need to eat so much that when I walk away from the table, I feel a lot of gut distension and I kind of need to like roll down the hall into bed or something along those lines. Think about that 80% full concept. And then the last one there, eat vegetables and protein at every meal. So if you have, I'd advocate a good source of protein because it's very satiating and helps people to limit their intake of other foods. And then fill up half your plate with vegetables, non-starchy vegetables in particular, which would be the potatoes and the squash and things along those lines, or what we would call starchy vegetables. Non-starchy vegetables would be pretty much everything else, right? So zucchini, broccoli, cauliflower, spinach, kale, asparagus, all those kind of things. Fill up your plate with those. You'll see a very full plate, and you'll see a lot of nutrient density, but what you won't see is a ton of excess calories. As far as performance goes, again, think first, I'm a human, and think second, I'm a cyclist. So don't just jump right into, okay, high performance eating. Think about all these other concepts that we've talked about as far as improving nutrition. Increase carbohydrates to match your energy needs, right? So this is where we were talking a little bit about the concepts of, aerobic versus anaerobic and things along those lines. Ensure that your caloric intake is adequate, right? To a certain extent, we can burn our body's fuel sources. But again, we talked about, replenishing those carbohydrates, particularly during more intense efforts. And then nutrient timing, right? So again, this concept of carbs before and after working out and during working out and so forth. I'll just throw out there that, this isn't as much of an issue as we used to think. There was some research done that said, there's this like 30-minute window after exercise, and you want to try to get in your carbohydrates then. And then we say, well, maybe the window is really 60 minutes. And then, and reality is if you're going to not exercise again for 24 hours, your body will replenish those glycogen stores over those 24 hours. You probably don't need to really emphasize that post-exercise window too much. But, at the same time, if you're going to eat carbohydrates, it's probably better to eat those in that immediate post-workout window. A question there from Dave. What is your go-to the night before and the day of the race to keep performing? So again, I've kind of tended towards a less carbohydrate dense approach. I don't, when I was more in my 20s and so forth, I would eat a lot of pasta and a lot of carbohydrates and things like that. Honestly, unless you do, a full carbohydrate depletion and, the whole carb loading approach. And even that, I think most people have kind of gotten away from that because unless you're doing extreme endurance efforts, that's really pretty unnecessary. So my recommendation for, the night before, eat what you like. Chances are you don't need to necessarily increase the amount of carbohydrates. Pretty much I will eat the same thing that I eat with most other meals, which would be, a source of protein, some vegetables, maybe a sweet potato, maybe some squash, something along those lines. I think the morning of, the key thing is to find what works for you. Lately, the last few times I've raced, I've eaten, again, my normal breakfast is something like eggs. And then maybe I'll have, you can tell I'm into sweet potatoes. Maybe I'll have a sweet potato, or maybe I'll have a Larabar or something along those lines, or maybe I'll take a Larabar along with me on the ride or something along those lines. But find the thing that works for you, and I would not stray too far from what you're used to eating. To me, that is really important, because if we end up, eating some crazy different thing that we're not used to eating, and then we find out halfway through the race it really didn't work for us. So steel cut oats, sliced almonds, chia seeds, raisins the morning of, that sounds like a great option for a lot of folks. Hard-boiled eggs, melons, and applesauce, also good. We got some protein, we got some carbohydrates there. Normal whatever. Yeah, there you go, right? So lots of good options, right? So and Noel comes in here too, and he says that the concept of routine, don't make major diet changes, right? So there we go. All right, let's see what else we got here. We're almost done, folks. I appreciate all your questions and all your interaction. Always good to know. We when we do these webinars, we're kind of here looking at our computer screen, so it's good to know there's folks out there in cyberspace listening to what we're saying. So the last one here. So we talked about maybe some body weight things. We talked about some performance things. Thinking about feeling your best, right? If you're not feeling your best, consider something like an elimination diet if you're already struggling with illness or GI upset. And again, I don't want to go too far into this, but you can easily look online for the idea of elimination diet. There's a lot of foods that can cause problems for folks. Some of those: wheat, dairy, soy, and something called FODMAPs. If you're not familiar with the concept of FODMAPs, FODMAPs are fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols, which is basically stuff that's going to rot in your gut potentially if you have this FODMAP intolerance. So again, if you're experiencing on the bike GI symptoms, consider that those might be one of your problems. So again, if you're like, I always feel, lousy when I after I have a plate of pasta or something like that, maybe consider eliminating gluten for a period of time. If you feel like every time you eat a lot of dairy products, you get a lot of gas and bloating, maybe you should consider eliminating dairy for 30 days and seeing how you look, feel, and perform afterwards. Try all different forms of on-the-bike nutrition. I left that statement there very vague. Again, goes back to the concept we talked about before, where we said, different things work for different people. One guy finds that, hammer gels work great for him. Another cyclist finds that the same gel, he takes it, and man, his stomach is in knots halfway through the ride. So find the things that work for you. And like Noel said, we don't want to try to experiment too much with our nutrition, particularly right around race time. The key to that experimentation should have been done weeks and months beforehand, and see if you can ferret out what works best for you, and then stick with that. So I think that just about does it. So we've had a whole bunch of questions already. I've been scrolling down to the bottom here, and I don't see anybody using the questions box there. So I've kind of been going through the chat box, and I think I've gotten a lot of the questions answered, but let me just scan through here real quick and see if there's anything jumping out at me. I see you guys have been having a conversation over here, so that's good. And while we got people talking, people interested, talking about nutrition.
Yeah, fantastic interaction, everybody. We really appreciate it. Gives us a lot of ideas for future presentations. And, it also, as I mentioned before, while some of the questions are a little bit more in depth that you guys have asked, fantastic questions. I love that you sent those out. Feel free to reach out to Matt afterwards. And also feel free to, I don't know if the offer popped up or not on there, but feel free to reach out to Matt to talk to him about setting up a nutritional consultation. So that's really where we'll be able to deep dive into some of the topics that you guys brought up too. Somebody had sent me an email as well and asked about the presentation and if we'd be sending a presentation slide. You should get an email. And sorry, Matt, I didn't mean to step on what you were doing there. But you should get an email about it. I think within a few minutes, up to maybe an hour afterwards, with a link, video. So the video of the presentation, so that you could rewatch and share on there. So one thing I want to mention a little bit more about, Matt, if you don't mind, is that when I put that note in there about routine and setting up the routine. I've been racing for over 2 decades, and I have a set routine. And so I really lock down what I am eating several days before, especially if it's a big race. I've had to deal with stomach upset in lots of races, especially like in a criterium style race, which is very fast and furious type of race. So with that, I need to make sure that I'm not eating anything several hours before. What I eat leading up is always the same type of food when I come to race day. So Matt alluded to a little bit about that, about getting into that routine, not experimenting with stuff, but take the time to be your own scientist to some degree when you're out there and you're doing your training, whether it is for a gravel race or it's for a criterium or a stage race or an Ironman race, make sure you're practicing this stuff ahead of time. And I'm not against you putting potatoes in your back pocket. I've been known to sneak a couple of salt potatoes in the back pocket, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. But find what works for you. And again, like I said, we're not proposing any one diet one way or the other. We're just saying, start with just eating the real food is the way to go and build habits on top of it. All right, Matt. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's great. Thanks for chiming in there, Noel. So I think we were going to try to keep this to about an hour just so we don't start losing people. And I can see that, again, positive comments there. So that's awesome. I thank you all for your questions. I thank you all for the interaction and everything. Noel, we ready to wrap this up?
Yeah, I think so. And I know there's a few open questions, so we'll reach out to you guys if we still have a couple of open questions. All right. But I think that's going to be it for the evening. Don't forget about a month from now, April 24th, I believe, 25th. I'm sorry, is our next webinar. And that again is going to be the Ironman Lake Placid by the numbers. We'll all talk about strategies that I use to plan, race, and analyze for our athletes for those type of races. All right. So again, thank you everybody. Appreciate you joining us, and we hope to see you on the next one.